Yeah.
So, are you saying that like absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence? Like, I'm just trying to take all that in.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't say a lot about what evidence is or isn't, right? I just said having a reasonable belief is going to be a matter of your evidence supporting that belief. Now, we could have a different debate about what sorts of things are evidence, but I could just grant you whatever you think evidence is, and then we can share that evidence with the theistic expert, right? So put in whatever you like. As long as we can share it with the other person, we can get ourselves in this situation where we can't reasonably believe the opposite of what they say. That's the idea.
Well, it just seems to me that reasonably, I guess it goes to what they were talking about faith before. If you can just throw your hands up and say, you know what, well, we just have to suspend judgment, you could probably put that with any claim. I mean, you have to base, evidence has to be based on reality, really. And it just, I don't know, I'm a little confused of what you're saying. I know this talk is, I'm trying to frame a question here too. If we're going to say that whatever it is ultimately unknowable, then how do we get to knowing anything? That's probably the wrong way to put it.
Okay, so let me try to put it a little bit more concretely then. So here's the sort of thing I'm thinking about. Let's suppose that we agree for the sake of argument, the only things that are relevant to whether or not God exists are, let's say, arguments for or against the existence of God. Right? So then I think up my best arguments against, the theist thinks up their best arguments for, and then we get together and we have a discussion. We share our arguments. We share our reasons for believing each of the premises. So this is all reasons-based. Nothing's being particularly faith-based. So perhaps they still believe on the basis of faith, but if they claim that the evidence, actually, the reason supports their view, then the idea would be, if we've shared all of our arguments and thereby shared all of our evidence, then if we disagree afterwards, one of us is messing up about what the evidence actually supports. So whether or not God exists, we could still have arguments about whether or not God exists. Yeah. So if these are the parts that are the evidence, if we share those and we disagree about what they support, and I admit that that person is just as smart as I am, just as good at assessing what the evidence is, then I can't tell whether it's me that's going wrong or it's the other person that's going wrong. And if that's the case, then we don't have good reason to think that the evidence in fact supports whatever our preferred position is. So if my preferred position is to maintain that God doesn't exist, I lose justification for that by sharing my evidence with somebody else who's at least as smart as me and comes to the opposite conclusion. That's part of the idea.
I think I need to take a class.
Sorry, I was trying to be quick because I know we're behind ourselves. So,
but we were kind of preparing for being late anyway, so.
I'm just curious about default positions. So, for example, if I claim that Russell's teapot is orbiting Venus, say, and it can't be detected on any scanners because we don't have the right resolution, is it my opponent's job to disprove that proposition, or is it my job to prove it, or do we share the burden of proof?
Part of my thought was, maybe I snuck it in, but part of my thought was, whatever it is for you to have a reasonable belief is going to involve what your evidence supports. So if that's right, then you don't get any reasonableness for free. So you don't get a default proposition that you just get to be reasonable in believing. You only get to be reasonable in believing something if you have evidence for it.
So in this case, you're saying that the suggesting that Russell's teapot exists would be wrong unless you had any evidence to start with that suggested it actually was there, not just the fact that we can't disprove that it's not there.
But so would the proposition that it isn't there would be equally wrong, right? Or
yeah, because I guess what you assume is default evidence for the teapot not being there is how could there be a teapot there?
So
sorry.
So let's suppose for fun that you believe no teapot orbits any planetary body, and I believe for some odd reason that a planet or has as a one of its orbiters a teapot, right? So suppose I'm trying to pull this move on you to get you to suspend judgment and become a skeptic about whether or not teapots orbit things, right? So then what we need to do is share what our reasons are for our beliefs. And so if I say, well, you know, my dowsing rod indicated to me that teapots are the sorts of things that circle planets and stuff like that, right? Then you've got a reason to reject what I'm claiming as my evidence in that case, right? So
It's not reasonable.
right,
Yeah.
right. So it involves this tricky question about figuring out what exactly is the evidence for a proposition, which is a pretty tough thing. But the thought is, if we could grant that bit, if we grant that we share evidence, then there's going to be a unique thing that evidence supports. Either it's going to support teapots circle planets, or it's not going to. And I imagine, since we have absolutely no reason to believe that there are teapots orbiting planets, and no one jettisoned a teapot with the right sort of trajectory for it to do that sort of thing, then that would be some evidence in favor of the proposition that teapots don't orbit planets. So I think that you would win then there, and we wouldn't get this epistemic symmetry that would make us have to give up. But I think in other cases it's tough. I mean, there are really smart theists. There are really smart people that probably disagree with you entirely politically, for instance, and are aware of all your reasons for your view, and are aware of all the objections that you have to their view, but still disagree with you. So I think that in cases like this, it's hard to see how to avoid being a skeptic.
Well, I do want to hear all the talks, so. And we don't know how long it's going to take to do the UFO thing. Because I take it that's a demonstration, right? Was there any other really, really strong questions that...
I have just one. Just
Okay.
one. I was trying to think how to frame it. But basically, what I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, Ray, is that if the evidence is the same and the arguments are what are different, that agnosticism about that question, if that's the right term, is what's reasonable in this case.
My thought is, if the evidence is the same and the conclusions are different,
Right.
and you
Yeah.
think you have just as good reason to think that the other person's as good at assessing the evidence as you are, then it seems like agnosticism is the only reasonable position you can take there. It's the only position that's supported by your total evidence in that situation.
Could I ask one really quick question on that? Would you admit that it might be an overly artificial construct, and if you apply it to reality, usually what it comes down to is quibbling over things that, you know, you still believe that your argument is sound, and they still believe that their argument is sound, but you're both kind of arguing over nuance. And so rather than accepting that this potentially artificial construct where you have both agreed on all of the knowledge and everything is built up, and then have two different
This
conclusions?
is because in real life you wouldn't accept that your opponent is as smart as you are.
Yeah, or you at least
Even though you have no evidence.
or you at least wouldn't know that they were. And so, if you apply this to reality, the assumption would be if you disagree with the smart person, you would conclude nothing, whereas...
Good. I worry that unlike most things in philosophy, this actually gets worse when we apply it to reality. So if I'm being honest, I'll admit that all sorts of people that disagree with me about all sorts of different topics are actually much more well informed about those topics and much better than I am at reasoning about those topics that I simply don't know as much about. So I think it actually makes it worse on the ground. I'm afraid it might be a lot more widespread.
That's good.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.